I'm Jonathan Horn.
I'm Cody Atkinson.
And I'm Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo. And this is the 110 Percenters podcast. Hello and welcome to 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. My name is Matteo Schlapek-Sevillo and I write the 1 Percenters newsletter. I'm joined by Cody Atkinson of the ABC. Cody, how are you, mate?
Yeah, not too bad, Matteo. How you doing?
Really, really well, thanks, mate. It's got a little bit cold in Melbourne. Winter has arrived, and I'm not sure I'm loving it so far, but other than that, really, really well.
Won't hear cold. We've had minus temperatures already here in Canberra, so Vic bias is what I'm saying.
Also joined by Jonathan Horn of The Guardian. Jonathan, how are you, mate?
I'm going very well. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, great to have you both. We are 2 episodes down, and hopefully hundreds more to go. Thank you to everyone who's kept listening and sharing their thoughts. It makes us better podcasters. On this week's episode, we'll be discussing Fremantle's win at the Gabba, declining Indigenous player numbers in the AFL, and the ghost at the Red and Black banquet, James Hird. Round 12 delivered its fair share of storylines. The Carlton Renaissance under Josh Fraser continued after the Blues once again bested the Cats. A supreme Sydney put the pain on a sorry Richmond outfit. The Western Bulldogs won another close game, this time against a Collingwood side that has clearly stopped training its late game scenarios. GWS overcame Melbourne in the Red Centre in a game between the two weirdest teams in footy. West Coast dispatched Essendon on Sunday night in a game characterised by huge amounts of rubbish flying about on the field, and that isn't a comment about the quality of the game that was served up. And of course, round 12 marked the beginning of the ever more protracted mid-season buys. Adelaide, Gold Coast, North Melbourne and Port Adelaide all had the week off. A blessed relief for this crabby Crows fan. But we're going to start at the Gabba, where Fremantle franked their now undeniable premiership credentials by walking into the Lions' den and sauntering out with the 4 points on Saturday evening. Justin Longmuir's side took the lead after 6 minutes and never relinquished control. They were supreme. They were steady. As Jonathan put it in this excellent piece, they have the width of history about them. So we're going to challenge the accepted wisdom that good news stories don't generate clicks by discussing the Dockers, their rise, their profile, and their credentials. Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. You wrote a great piece about the Dockers that I just quoted from. There's a lot of it I could quote about their list build, about the performance, but just, I guess, take us through, the experience of watching Freo this season and writing that piece, and I guess how they stack up to you.
Yeah, it's interesting you said before that Freo don't necessarily get the clicks. I've always found out otherwise. I've always sort of found otherwise with them. I've always found their supporter base to be incredibly engaged and sort of hungry for content. And so to write about them was a pleasure this week. I think one thing that I took from, there was obviously probably more of a focus on Saturday's game than there has been on some of their other games this year, simply because of that Brisbane factor. But I'm not entirely sure that we saw them at their best on Saturday. I think that they've got a lot of plaudits, including from people like me, and a lot of talk about them as premiership favourites. But they were scratchy at times in that game. They had a superb third quarter, but they were just sort of going in that first half. And I think that in terms of Fremantle, I think the reasons to get excited about them sort of came earlier in the year in some of those really, really key wins, a lot of those at home. And I think, we're not quite sure how much that win over Brisbane means right now, given the state of Brisbane at the moment. Having said that, they were fantastic, and we saw them at their best in that third quarter. And this is what they do. They have these 10, 15-minute periods where they just go bang, 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 and they can just put teams away. And I think that's, at this stage, what differentiates them from some of those great Docker teams, say of the Ross Lyon era, is that ability to just turn up the wick and take it to a new level. And in every one of those 11 wins this year, they've done exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you say that this is, an exciting and pretty explosive Freo team, and I agree with you. They can pile on the goals in a quick space of time, but it's still a team, I think, that is built on really solid foundations, isn't it? And you sort of think about how Longmuir made his bones as an assistant coach, right? Learning that kind of defensive system, and obviously his time with Ross Lyon And Cody, I'm going to ask you, your impressions, being the kind of tactico of the three of us. But first, I'm going to, maybe quote some stats to give listeners some context about what we're really seeing with this Freo team. And the defensive stuff just jumps out so strongly. They're first for opposition first possession, so they're just not letting the opponent get their hands on the ball at stoppage. First for Oppo, first possession to clearance rate. First for opposition scores from stoppages, from turnovers. Second for Oppo chain to score. So this is defensively the best team in footy at the moment. They're pretty handy with the ball, but most of their work is done off the ball. Cody, really interested in your thoughts about what you think and what you see when you look at Freo.
Freo is just such an interesting team to watch play footy because they've had a handful of different identities or semi-identities under Justin Longmire, because I think they've been trying to work out what style fits the personality of the players that they've got. I think in the past they've defaulted to clearance winning game and relatively conservative ball movement out of D50 and the back half. And they've had a lot of great intercept markers, right? And if you're not willing to pull the trigger, it can kind of just create repeat inside 50s against you, and it just builds up pressure. And in the big moments, that's when it hurts, right? And this year, I think we've seen a bit more willingness to fly a bit more aggressively. And I think the forward setups that they've deployed helps that. A lot's made of their big three tall forwards. The fact that they've got a Miss Tracy and Voss, maybe the most polarizing guy in the league. I'm kind of anyone else there. I'm pro Voss. Anyone? I'm pro Patrick.
Yeah,
anyone else?
I don't love it. I got to say, not for me, Paddy Voss.
I'd love to play with him. He'd be a great player to have alongside me.
Yeah, he's one of those guys, right? He gets them pumped up, I reckon. And sometimes that's the missing element. And he was being looked at for VFL opportunities before he was picked up SSP, I think it was. I think it's a bit of a furphy, though, because they're not getting a tremendous amount of marks inside 50 per entry. It's their ground guys that contribute. It's a whole forward line attack. They're about the most efficient at turning inside 50s into goals. They get a lot of volume, but it's the efficiency that kills it. And their fourth quarter mode, where Bolton's been just playing so incredibly well in the fourth, it's a bit insane. So I think they're a great contested marking side, sure, because they play more tools than pretty much any other side in the league. But it's the smalls that do a lot of damage.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think that extra layer that Justin Longmuir, you may have said Justin Longmire before, Cody.
I'm so tired, guys.
We'll chalk that up to fatigue. I just wanted to make sure there weren't listeners out there screaming and thinking, well, hold on, these guys are meant to know what they're talking about. I really like that layer that Longmuir has added in, that kind of running from deep positions, the willingness to bite off a little bit more corridor. This is a team that I think still is quite fundamentally conservative in its disposition and sort of defense first and about that stable base. But I think their ability to kind of, hold, contain, absorb, and then break from deeper positions, and particularly using the speed and the smarts of guys like Shea Bolton and Murphy Reid. They're a lot of the two sort of forward half players that people were talking a lot about with Freo at the moment. And their cleverness and their ability, particularly to take ground. That's something I really noticed. Freo are sort of that they're just a bit more aggressive, even with their kind of their running at the moment. And yet, Jonathan, as you pointed out in your piece, they're a little bit contrary to the kind of meta, the style of footy that everyone seems to be playing, or at least talking about this year. Because Freo are doing all of this and they're being so successful, but they're not a massive meters gained by hand team. I think they're only 9th in the AFL so far this season.
That's right. And in a way, let's not forget the amount of criticism that they attracted last year, and especially the coach. This idea that they're this boring conservative team and that was to their detriment. And so much of that, a lot of that, I think, and I wrote about this last year, but a lot of that is to do with Longmuir himself and his personality and the way that he presents.
He's so measured, isn't he?
He is, but he's also not one of those kind of alpha coaches who sort of, I always felt that the media was a little bit more willing to get stuck into Longmuir when things weren't going well. And I think
you're doing the name check too, aren't you?
I was doing it as well. We're all terrified to not accidentally say Longmire.
We want to be allowed into Western Australia one day, I think.
Yeah, they're very parochial over there too about these things. But look, and you know, Matteo, you said this before. There hasn't been a huge change from that run that they went on last year, where off the top of my head, I think it was something like 12 of their last 14 that they won. I don't think that they're an especially vastly different team to that. I think they're a little bit more reliable at the bottom end. I think their role players have stepped up a bit. They've had about 3 or 4 players who have vastly improved. But yeah, it's interesting to contrast like the talk about them now, like, you know, almost the hottest team to talk about right now, with the way they were being spoken about last year as this boring. There was always this talk about their ball movement, and their ball movement's so boring and tedious, and that it's going to come unstuck in the final, which, you know, to some extent it did. I just don't think there's been a huge change. I think that they've maintained that consistency for about 12 months now.
There's one of my favorite measures of ball aggressiveness. It's called expected retention rate for kicking, right? And that tells you more or less, are you taking riskier kicks, or are you taking more conservative kicks? If you're taking riskier kicks, your expected retention is lower. And if you're taking less risky kicks, it's higher, obviously. Freo was, I think, top 4 in 2024 for the least risky kicks in the league. And I think particularly in the back half, they were pretty much with Melbourne as the least risky team in using the ball. This year, they're bottom 2. Like they're the second riskiest team or third riskiest team, right? Yep. You take execution away from it. It's sort of identity that they're willing to go corridor, they're willing to go quickly, they're willing to go deeper. Taller targets helps that. Good ball users helps that. Sorry, Matteo, I hope I didn't cut you off.
No, you didn't at all. In fact, I think you made a point which is really complementary to what I was going to say, which is, and that statistic you just quoted, Cody, about expected kick retention and how Freo have just introduced a little bit more risk. That's a sort of trust and continuity piece, and I think that's a great feather in the cap of Longmuir, that he has been there for a long time now. He has worn those kind of slings and arrows, and he's, you know, spent a lot of political capital, and there are a lot of Freo fans who, you know, wanted him gone, frankly. You know, they missed the finals in, 2024. Of course, it was such a logjam at the top of the ladder last season, but they ended up, of course, you know, losing in that home elimination final. He's stuck with it. I don't think he quite uses this language, but he's obviously a very process-oriented guy. And I think that's, you know, we're seeing the dividends of that now, that trust, that continuity, that stability. Jonathan, I am going to quote from the piece you wrote now, because it's going to help us pivot just a little bit. I'll quote one of the last paragraphs. Fremantle don't have a single father-son academy selection or free agent. They have nailed their high, mid-range and speculative picks, rookie draft selections of the rescue dogs of the footy world, and they've unearthed some gems in there. Tracy and Carl Warner in particular. I might add Isaiah Dudley. He was an SSP pick, but still I think spiritually fits in that mould. And they've excelled at identifying and nurturing discarded players from other clubs. So it has been a long and patient rebuild. They haven't been able to take any shortcuts, and it, of course, hasn't yielded a cup yet. But it kind of looks like the platonic ideal of a rebuild in the modern AFL, doesn't it?
It does, and it's to be admired. And I must say, I wrote a column yesterday and didn't properly attribute some of those stats. So a lot of that came from Craig O'Donoghue at the Western Australian, who pointed out quite a few of those things that I picked up on with the list construction and what they've done. And look, to be honest, a little bit of that was to sort of contrast that with Brisbane as well, and you know, that argument about which team's been given the favours, and you know, there's always sort of that issue bubbling around. But yeah, full credit to people like David Walls and the way that they have operated, often with a bit of criticism coming their way at the time, but they've sort of held their nerve and backed themselves, and they've just got a really, really good eye for talent, and they like I said, they identify them and they back them in and they put them in the right roles, and so far it's bearing fruit.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned David Walls, because I published a piece on the One Percenters website a couple of weeks ago where I interviewed Alex, in inverted commas, who's an AFL club list manager. And I sort of mentioned in the lead, I think, of the piece and in sort of the social media promo that, most supporters don't really know much about their club's list manager. And I did have a few Freo fans say, well, we actually know a hell of a lot about David Walls because he's done a lot of amazing work at this footy club. Cody, I'm not sure if there's anything that you think is sort of especially interesting or impressive about Freo's list build that we haven't maybe mentioned yet.
Look, I just think that they've done really well at targeting the pieces that they need through trade, preseason supplemental, all these alternative pathways that you don't really expect much from. Of course, delisted free agents they've had come in and do stuff. They've really spent a lot at times too to get guys like Jackson Bolton, etc. in, but the real wins, I reckon, have been at the edges. Like Judd McVee has been good for them. Like they've had Mason Cox step in and play games for them. Patrick Voss, of course. Like they've done just such phenomenal work at the margins. Like long term, that regresses, right? You're not going to hit Tracy in the rookie draft all the time. It happens once every while. And once you start thinking you can strike magic all the time, like that's when you get into real trouble. But I think they've just, they've really targeted recruiting to the way that they want to play. And Longmuir has shaped how they play a little more to their listings, things like having smalls deep up forward and have their talls lead up into space so they can create marking targets down the ground stuff, beat them with speed, all that type of thing. Classic Western Australian footy.
And now that we've talked them up so much, they'll probably go and fall in a heap now because that's, I think we did the same thing to Melbourne a fortnight ago and they haven't won since.
Well, I hope Mateo asked that question is, do you think they're for real? I really want to, I can ask you guys that. Do you actually think that they're the faves?
Oh, faves. Well, I guess we did a little bit of rapid fire on this last week, didn't we? Faves is tough, right? And I think particularly because just the delta in terms of style and impression that Fremantle and Sydney in particular make is just so vast, right? They kind of feel like two teams from different kind of footy universes. But Fremantle, I think completely legit. I really don't have any doubts that the way they play can scale into September, because I think it's sort of defensive and, solid and defense first, but it's pretty versatile now. And I think, there have been a couple of layers that they've added. The talent is rich in teaming. They have players, they have a system, and then they have players who can work outside of system, like Shea Bolton, which I think is so important and is so key to winning the flag. So I think they're absolutely legitimate, and let me sit on the fence just a little bit and say that they're in my top 2 flag favourites.
Jonathan?
Yeah, likewise. I think that they've also got a really, really good draw now. They stay in Western Australia for the next month, and then even after that, it really opens up. So it means that they can rest players, the way other premiers have done in recent years. You saw them win on Saturday without Sarong and Young, which is a really, really good effort. And that's the sort of thing that they can do once their players get a bit sore through winter and things like that. I will say this though, and that is that they're going to be under enormous pressure in that city if they host 2 finals. Let's hypothetically say that. The amount of hysteria and expectation, you've only got to read that newspaper over there to know that they take things to extremes over there, and those players are going to be under extreme pressure. And I think it does help to have a very measured, phlegmatic sort of coach in that situation, because he's in many ways just the complete opposite of what you read in a headline in the Western Australian. Is kind of tempered by listening to Justin Longmuir speak for 5 minutes.
Let me break the other way, guys. I have them at the bottom. Let's say that there's a slight cluster at the top of 4 teams. Mm-hmm. Sydney, Hawthorn, Fremantle, and Geelong. I probably have them, I think I said 4th last week in that group, and last week's win over Brisbane, while impressive, doesn't change my priors. And there is a slight question mark for me getting to September, how heavily they score off intercepts and deep intercepts in particular. We've known in the past teams like the Giants and Collingwood, it's really, if it works really well and it looks really impressive, but there's a habit for it falling over in September, relying on deep scoring versus that forward half territory game. I just think it's slightly less robust in September.
So for context, Freo are currently 5th for scoring from turnovers, but you mentioned there's sort of spatial element there and the fact that they're pretty happy to absorb deep D50 entries because they really trust their key backs, but how well they're rebounding off that. And their D50 to F50 transition is by no means kind of league leading. So if there's a flaw in the makeup for Freo, I think it's that. And those 3 other leading contenders, they're all better at scoring from turnover than Freo have been so far this year.
Yeah, and a D half turnover, like that's where they get a large proportion of their score. We know that they've had a couple of blowout wins, which I think have juiced the numbers and have juiced. If you look at their D half and D50 to scoring, it's a lot higher than their ability to get the ball up there. And that's sometimes a sign that maybe they've run into a team that's sort of given up the ghost there a bit in the second half. I think this is such a deep year, and this is why it's such a great time to start a podcast talking about footy, because I reckon there's still conceivably like 12, 13 teams that have some shot of deep finals.
Totally agree. We probably should move on, but maybe it's just worth ending on this note that Freo fans who, of course, there's many of them and many of them have Substacks and write beautifully and eloquently about their side. They're now going through this difficult transition from, I guess, being a young and rebuilding side that isn't really expected to win to a genuine contender. And that does change the supporter experience. The expectations go up. Freo fans, I've seen it myself. They've been fond, I think, of quoting their average age and games played stats after disappointing defeats. But now they're forced to confront a somewhat uncomfortable fact. Their team is very, very good. It does change the equation. We will be right back on 110 percenters talking about the decline in Indigenous player numbers.
You're listening to 110 Percenters.
You're back on 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. The AFL has just observed Sir Doug Nicholls round, a fortnight of celebrating the immense contributions that Indigenous players, coaches, supporters, and administrators have and continue to make to the game. All 18 clubs unveiled an Indigenous Guernsey. 6 clubs changed their names. Adelaide became Gooniyja, Fremantle became Walyalup, Melbourne became Naarm, Port became Yatapulti, St Kilda became Yurok, West Coast became Walich Marawa. Each game featured a special ceremony, but one element is increasingly missing: Indigenous players. Just one Indigenous player featured in the Dreamtime at the G game, the showpiece of Sir Doug Nicholls round. According to the AFL, there are 62 Indigenous players currently on AFL club lists. That's down from 87 in 2020. In every year since then, the number of Indigenous players on list has declined. Fewer are being drafted and more are being delisted. AFL CEO Andrew Dillon, with his characteristic profundity, admitted in a press conference launching this year's Sir Doug Nicholls round that the AFL has, quote, plenty of work to do. But what work does the league intend on doing? Part of its response involves a new First Nations Impact Fund, which aims to grow First Nations representation across the industry, creating culturally safe environments and calling out racism wherever it exists. The fund is believed to be worth about $300,000, less than the median AFL player salary, to be distributed between the 18 clubs. The AFL is also considering giving clubs an extra list spot specifically for First Nations players. A subcommittee of AFL and club figures met for the first time on the eve of Sir Doug Nicholls round to discuss ways to boost the number of Indigenous players. This is not an easy subject. None of us are Indigenous, yet we do believe it's an important subject. So we are going to talk about it. Jonathan, I might start with you, I guess, before we get into perhaps the decline and what it means and ways to arrest that decline. It's probably worth acknowledging the celebration of Indigenous culture and contributions that Sir Doug Nicholls round has become. I mean, obviously those contributions are immense, but Sir Doug Nicholls round has really kind of grown, I think, in a beautiful way to honour and, I guess, recognise those contributions.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary fortnight that the AFL put on, and to get, what was it at that Richmond Essendon game? Perhaps 75,000 people to watch probably the 2 worst teams in the AFL slug it out. A lot of that is because of the occasion and because of what it means and because of the way it's been nurtured and the way it's been promoted as well. Look, I just think, however, that with events like that sometimes it's a way for the league to almost pat itself on the back and sort of marvel at the magnificence of what it's doing in this area. Because, you know, you've got all these wonderful young men and women dancing, and you get these lovely designs on the jumpers, and everyone's feeling good about themselves, and everyone's feeling good about, you know, our relationship with Aboriginal Australia. But as you wrote in your piece recently, which is a really, really good piece, there's a much wider malaise there. And it's something that's incredibly complex. And it's something that we really struggle, not just in sport, but in Australia generally, is we struggle to actually have a conversation about things like that. The way that this issue, and this is something that you articulated really well. And it's the sort of thing that can only really be articulated on a forum like the One Percenters website, where you have space, where you can actually really go in depth on an issue like this. But, you know, the way that you sort of talked about how this is an issue that intersects all aspects of Australia. It's to do with economic opportunity. It's to do with class. It's to do with our education system. It's to do even things like our housing market and things like that are all factors at play here as to why more young Aboriginal men and women aren't getting into the system, why they're not being properly nurtured, and why numbers are declining. I think it's, I'd encourage anyone listening now to read that piece as a sort of backgrounder to that.
Cody, Jonathan, thank you very much. Cody, look, of course there are these kind of broader societal reasons. The AFL, as powerful as it is, can't do anything about them. But there are, I suppose, more local structural reasons, and they have to do, I suppose, with changes to how clubs recruit and ways that Indigenous, I guess, players or the Indigenous talent pathways are funded by the AFL. And then there's, I guess, the fact that tactically the game has changed in ways that maybe sort of run counter to traditional Indigenous, I guess, player archetypes or the types of players that have traditionally been recruited. Really interested in your view, I guess, on what might be responsible for this decline. We're talking about, 25 fewer Indigenous players in the system today than 6 years ago.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think putting that decline, 25 is a pretty big drop. List numbers have dropped. So list numbers have dropped about, 10%. So you'd expect a slight drop, but not that severe. I think it's interesting looking at the a bit more about the history of Indigenous participation in football, right? We had, for the first 80 years, 90 years at the elite level, we had maybe 8 Indigenous Victorians play in the VFA, VFL, right? It was a very small number. And these days, I think we've got somewhere between sort of 5 and 8 Victorian Indigenous players in the AFL. We've had at times more people from the town of Halls Creek, more Indigenous Australian footballers from the town of Halls Creek in Western Australia, with a population of 1,900 people than the entire state of Victoria, Indigenous footballers from the entire state of Victoria. At one point, it was the Goods brothers, right? So I think it's an asymmetric issue. But so I'll continue on with my history thing. We've had a history of exclusion of Indigenous participation of football in Victoria. There was a long history of teams like Lake Tyers dominating in the 1890s and 1900s and then getting excluded from the competition. Framlingham players like Pompey Austin was arguably the first to play in 1870s, played one game, played with the originator of the code, Wills, and then wasn't allowed again. There was players who played...
sorry to interrupt. Framlingham, I believe, is where Jamara Ugle-Hagan is from. Yeah,
it is from where Jamara is from, and he's the first to play VFL, AFL football, I understand, from Framlingham, which I think is the biggest Indigenous community in Victoria. Of course, I don't live in Victoria now, so it's a bit hard. So I think it's an asymmetric issue in the fact that potentially there's Victorian development for Indigenous footballers that's very different to how Western Australian develops. And another factor is what's happened to the Flying Boomerangs program. I don't know if you guys know about the Flying Boomerangs, but it used to be a travel team for 14 to 16-year-old Indigenous players that developed, and they often took them overseas. I think South Africa was one of the locations. 2017, they stopped the travel team and they moved to a domestic game versus a World All Stars. That program ceased, of course, during COVID. And if you have a look at the dip in players and the long-term dip, you've got to think about whether that lack of centralized program might have something to do with it. And then you've got the other COVID-related impacts with the lack of travel for some of these teams in rural and remote communities when you couldn't travel that far, and you've got so much there. Halls Creek, I've mentioned Halls Creek before. They haven't had a footy oval for the last 2 or 3 years, so they've had a lack of development up there. When we've been thinking about investment in community level programs, often it's just like one point of failure. I think there's a lot of interrelated points, right? That it's the lack of numbers is more like the canary in the mine, right? And you address the bigger structural issues, the numbers will come back. But it's the structural issues that are more important about community engagement and making sure there's grassroots footy being played. Sorry, I could talk for hours on this.
Partly, you mentioned COVID, Cody. Partly, I think what we've seen is, you know, effects that are downstream of cuts to list sizes and the soft cap during COVID that still haven't been fully restored. Caroline Wilson was speaking on the Ages Real Footy podcast last week, I believe it was, that clubs, since the Hawthorn racism saga, they're mandated to have an Indigenous player liaison officer at the club 3 days a week. And she named a club, I won't name the club, but she did, so you can go back and listen to it if you like, where the Indigenous player liaison officer was apparently at the club only 1 day a week. Now, I have no idea if that is a generalised trend across the league or just a sort of cherry-picked example. But I suppose, Jonathan, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that clubs, I guess, are utility maximising and sort of ruthless in a way about how their soft cap money gets spent, and maybe some of them didn't really think that was that you know, yielded a great ROI, that sort of stuff. But it's hard also to then avoid the conclusion that when we're hearing about Indigenous players maybe experiencing higher levels of I guess, lower levels of cultural safety, well, maybe that's part of the reason why.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And also, you know, is for an 18-year-old Indigenous footballer to walk into an AFL environment, the fact of the matter is that a lot of these young men are going to be coming from extremely different backgrounds to the other young men who are being drafted into the system. I just to sort of deviate a little bit on that, I remember doing a story for Good Weekend magazine for Fairfax, probably about 15 years ago. And I interviewed 2 young Aboriginal footballers. One was Ross Tangatalum, Ross Tangatalum.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And Waylon Manson, who were 2 just utterly astonishing talents. Actually, there was a third that I interviewed, Zeph Skinner, who ended up playing at the Western Bulldogs for a while. 3 of the most sort of incredible talents that you would ever see, 2 of which ended up on AFL lists, and both of which utterly struggled with living in Melbourne and sort of grasping the sort of demands that were being asked of their coaches at the time. Now, Ross played under another Ross Lyon, in 2009 and 2010, back when St Kilda were absolute maniacs in terms of how they trained and what was demanded of them. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're 15 years on now, and you're seeing a level of sort of planning and pathway nurturing that starts at an increasingly early age with footballers, especially in Victoria. And I think we're just at a point where clubs are not willing to take that risk on an Aboriginal 18-year-old or 19-year-old player coming into the system. And it was something that you spoke about in your piece, was that how do we give clubs greater capacity to take on that risk and to maybe spend 2 or 3 years nurturing a player where someone else from the under 18 competition might be ready to go straight off the shelf. I think that it's interesting to contrast what we said before with say, a club like Essendon. Now, it's a travesty that Essendon would have 1 Indigenous player playing in that game in Sir Doug Nicholls round. You know, you look at someone like Kevin Sheedy and what Essendon did 20, 30 years ago, and it was that curiosity, but it was also that risk appetite to really back in these young guys and put safeguards around them and have a lot of young Aboriginal players playing together. And it was an all of club approach. driven by men like Sheedy. And I just don't see a lot of clubs willing to do that now. I think that they're very risk averse. They're very sort of, just got to play straight down the line here. And I think that the game is all the poorer for that, and the clubs are as well.
Here's one. I think maybe the issue is, and maybe part of the issue is that we look at it from a club-specific perspective, whereas I think there's a lot of peer group. A lot of footy players are friends with players from other clubs. They live with players from other clubs. I think maybe there's an increased competitiveness which makes things closed house rather than peer communities amongst, say, Indigenous footy players or footy players from certain particular groups. Maybe that's part of the thing. Like, I know Brad Hill, for example, is a mentor to a lot of Indigenous footy players playing out of Victoria. Maybe there should be more formalised networks in place rather than Indigenous liaisons looking after merely one club.
And that's something that Ross Lyon talks about in nearly every time that he speaks about his list. Is their commitment to their Indigenous players, and they have gone to great lengths. And we saw that with the Lance Collard case. Occasionally they have to veer into very uncomfortable areas about backing their player, and in that case, it's an example of something done really well, I think, in terms of what St Kilda are doing with their star Indigenous players.
We've had this conversation, and we've obviously all been, the three of us have been proceeding on the assumption that declining Indigenous player numbers is a problem worth addressing and worth trying to solve. That obviously is not an assumption that would be shared by everyone. There'll be people who'd say that, well, Indigenous players are still significantly overrepresented relative to Indigenous Australians' share of the national population. The AFL, they talk about this, at least around Sir Doug Nicholls round every year. So at least in that narrow sense, the AFL does consider it a problem. I spoke at the top of the segment about the AFL's proposed solutions, a sort of bespoke Indigenous rookie list spot, which maybe a cynic would say, well, that's a pretty easy way to go from 62 to about 80 Indigenous players in the AFL. But what do we, and maybe Cody, I'll begin with you, not to sort of, put the brunt of responsibility for solving this big and complex problem on your shoulders, but what do you think a real solution or a kind of set of solutions might look like, given, I guess the constraints that the AFL works under?
Thanks for asking me the question. It is a big responsibility. And this is something that I probably should have prefaced, and all of us should have prefaced. I'm not Indigenous. I'm not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And I think there's a lot of work that's been done over the years, both in sport and in the general community, where non-Indigenous people try to solve Indigenous issues without consulting them adequately and bringing them along with the journey. So consider this only an advisory voice from the outside. And I think any solution needs to be co-designed and co-owned by the Indigenous community and Indigenous leaders, and potentially a peak body. I think there needs to be a broader strategy rather than a thought bubble. The rookie list idea, look, you can look at the cynical view that it'll boost numbers, whatever. My concern is the rookie list process in general, that if it's a 1-year contract, I imagine it's meant to be a free hit, that exacerbates a lot of the problems for these young men, that if they're moving from rural WA or rural NT to cold Victoria for one winter, playing some VFL footy and then getting delisted, that's going to make everything worse, not better. If it's going to be a specific list spot for Indigenous talent or an NGA extension, if there's like a Cat B NGA extension, that, without getting too nerdy, like, it needs to have at least a 2 or 3 year guarantee that you're going to keep someone on and try to develop them. There needs to be better support networks. I think there needs to be a more holistic solution rather than here's a list spot that you can only use on Indigenous talent, because if that was going to solve the problem, I think we would have come to that solution by now. Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree with that. And something, Matteo, that you've touched on, not just in your piece on Indigenous footballers, but with your interview with the list manager as well, is that need to really have a good hard look at the rookie system and how that works and how clubs are gaming that. Because the AFL like to throw money at things, and I think one thing's for sure is they've thrown a certain amount of money at this, but it's probably it's not enough, really. I just think that this at the top level has to really be club driven and culturally driven by senior coaches, by development staff, by presidents. I think it starts at the top with clubs, and I think that St Kilda are a good example of that in action. Just as Essendon were a good example of that in action in the 1990s and the 2000s. I think that that is how we are going to get numbers up.
Questions, not necessarily solutions, but at least we're asking the questions. I'll close with this excerpt from a great article, actually, on the from the AFL Players Association website from 13 years ago about that Flying Boomerangs program, which you mentioned, Cody. It does seem kind of sadly and ironically prescient in a way. The Flying Boomerangs program is an integral part of the AFL agenda. The number of Indigenous players being recruited to clubs is ever increasing, and there is little doubt that it will continue to do so in the future. The AFL recognises this and will continue to provide young Indigenous men with opportunities that will help them to play at an elite level, while at the same time fostering their pride of being Indigenous Australians. We'll be right back on 110 Percenters.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
We're back on 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. Cody Atkinson, Jonathan Horn and me, Matteo Schlapik-Savillo. We've had our entree, we've had our main. Now it's time for a crisp lemon sorbet to cleanse our palates. That's right, it's time for another edition of From the Hip. One host asks, two hosts respond.
From the Hip.
Jonathan, I believe the first question is yours.
And this is for you, Cody. Have the Saints actually improved this year?
The celestial beings or the footy team? Sorry, different conversation.
the band.
I think the Saints, they're a conundrum wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a shoebox. I think some elements of their game have gotten significantly better, but I think what they've sacrificed in other parts has sort of made up for it. I think they're in the midst of transitioning their style and their identity a bit. I think it's a bit too early to judge. I think compared to how much hype that they were getting in the off-season about their rocketing up the ladder, that hasn't happened. But I think there are some green shoots there, but they're far from the finished package yet. Matteo?
A provisional yes, but not by enough to accomplish the goal, which I think probably drove the pivot in St Kilda's list management strategy, which was the retention of Nazaya. I'm not sure they've really shown quite enough for that. I think there's been a decline in output among older players. Mason Wood, for example, offset, I would say, by really good and sustained and real growth from younger players. Darcy Wilson and Hugo Garcia, I think, jump out. There's also just the sort of stark and I don't know, banal in a way reality that St Kilda are not going to be a serious team in this current iteration without a proper key forward. And they don't have one because the one they have has been out of the game for 2 years with injuries.
You're sort of losing as a club if you're just if your entire recruitment and list strategy is designed to keep one player. One player doesn't make a team in modern footy. You kind of got to think more holistically. If their only goal is to keep Naz, they've sort of lost before they hit the field, right?
Agree, but I think we should move on to the next question. That is, however, definitely a subject we should tackle in a future episode. Jonathan, should Adam Uze's position be coming under scrutiny?
I don't think so. I think it is utterly impossible to judge anything to do with Richmond over the last 2 years. I think their injury list is such that it's almost a mulligan. It's just, I can't think of a coach. I don't think there's this pervading sense with Uze that he's not the long haul guy. But I just think that if he were to come under greater scrutiny, he could just point at the fact that he's got this entire crop from what's really the best draft we've seen almost, who are all in the sheds. I find they've shown some great spirit in times. They showed some really great spirit in that game against West Coast, even against Melbourne. But yeah, obviously they were appalling against Sydney on the weekend, but they wouldn't be the first to get belted by Sydney.
They've got about 4 fit blokes, don't they? That not teenagers, not kids. Like all their promising kids are hurt. They've got Tom Lynch playing, but they've aggressively traded to rebuild in the window just before Tassie snags a lot of picks, just before everyone else tries to get in. They've got a strategy. I think Uze has gotten as much as anyone could get out of it. If you were going to sack him, it would be for that inflatable camel that he did before his first preseason. I think that was the most objectionable thing he's done. But beyond that, like, I think he's done what you would say is a able job. Whether he gets the chance to coach a team in contention, I don't know, but I don't think he's done anything to prevent him from at least having a crack for a year or two.
But what about his aura, Cody? He has no aura, according to our aura. We need aura in the coaches. Hello, Justin Longmuir.
Yeah. Justin Longmuir doesn't have aura.
I mean, you've talked to a few coaches. Like, this is not from the hip. This is a side hip. This is the other hip. How many coaches genuinely have like this show-stopping aura, and how much does it actually matter?
It's utter nonsense. I mean, you could go back through history, and you know, it's you know, I remember
maybe Barassi in his suits.
When Alistair Clarkson first turned up at Hawthorn, they thought he was a gopher. They thought he was there to fix the air conditioning or something. This short little man walked into the room, and they sure as hell didn't think he had an aura then, but they quickly found out that he was a little bit more than that. So, yeah, I think...
it's wild, isn't it? Like, aura. Oh, I'm so old now, hey. I have to look up the definition on Urban Dictionary of these things, guys.
I reckon you've aged a few months just during this recording, I reckon, Cody. I think the last question is yours.
Yeah, Mateo, I'm going to send it back your way. So this is one that we got from our community on Twitter, and we encourage you to send questions in each week. There's some great ones that we're going to get to in future weeks, but this one is from Liam, Free Kick Liam on Twitter. Who is a player who has improved in the last month that we should be talking about more?
I realised at the top of the segment that I didn't have a good answer prepared for it, but I think I've come up with one that I'm happy with while the two of you gentlemen have been chatting. I really like Jack Eisen at Carlton. The lad, I believe, an Indigenous, well, sort of NGA.
Victorian Indigenous, yeah.
Victorian Indigenous, pick 47 maybe off the top of my head in last year's draft. He looks absolutely fabulous.
Do you know his parents' name too, or...?
Well, I think probably I just follow a lot of Carlton folks on social media, and it is true they have been excited about him for some time, and dating back to pre-season. He just looks like a modern footy player. He kind of, I don't know, he looks like someone who will fill out physically, but he has cleverness, he has touch, he has, dare I say it, aura. Jack Eisen.
That's a good one. And exactly what Carlton needed too. They needed a player like that, just a bit of spark. I'm going to make this even more about Fremantle and just throw in a few of their sort of bottom sixes, so to speak, who have vastly improved this year. Warner, Dudley, Chapman, they've all got better. Frederick, players like that. And that was always going to be Fremantle's issue, was just around the margins. And getting improvement out of guys like that has been crucial.
Cody, a quick one from you.
Oh, look, Freo is where I was going to go. Sam Switowski is probably like one of the more underappreciated guys in the comp, and I've long liked his work. Look, I've long been a Connor Iden fan, so I'm not going to put anyone else on there, but he's just such an integral part. Everyone talks about Lockie Ash, but no way Lockie Ash should have made this All-Australian team last year before Connor Iden, let alone Iden's improved work this year. I think there's just what I like about the last couple of draft crops is historically it's taken a few years for them to hit the ground running. In the last 3 or 4 years, and I was talking to a club guy about this last year, players are seeming more able and more willing to fill a role early in their career and more able to at least play an attacking role. Defense takes a bit longer. And that's just so good to see, the fact that we're equipping some of these young players to contribute from day one.
Couldn't agree more. Very strong endorsement on the Connor Iden point. All right, that has been From the Hip for this week. Please keep sending through your questions, listeners. We are going to take a break and come back with our final segment, the James Hird Great Debate on 110 Percenters.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
We're back for our final segment. Listeners, on the off chance that you spent the last week not consuming any footy media, but somehow still listening to 110 Percenters, if so, thank you. It now looks possible, perhaps even likely, that James Hird will be the next coach of Essendon. The situation is evolving one strategic leak to a friendly journo at a time. Yes, the whole footy world is talking about Hird and Essendon, but that's because it's an interesting and important subject, and one that reveals a lot about how influence operates at this famous old club. We're going to approach the topic from a slightly different angle, one that we think is more maybe intellectually honest and stimulating than the average. We're going to try and have a little bit of a debate. I'm going to argue the affirmative case that James Hird is the right choice, or at least not a bad choice to be Essendon's next head coach. Jonathan will argue the negative case. We'll take some turns to speak. Cody, like Socrates before him, will act as the good-natured moderator and interlocutor. We might declare a winner at the end. We haven't decided yet. Jonathan, the floor is yours. Why shouldn't James Hird be the next coach of Essendon?
Boy, oh boy, how long have we got, guys?
About 10 minutes.
Give me a couple of hours. Okay, I'm just going to loosen the shoulders a bit and have a crack here. Look, I think all three of us probably at various times have worked in and around politics in sort of other careers in our life. And I think that
no comment.
A bit of a veil, a bit of a fourth wall breaking there, Jonathan.
But not for a long time, but in our earlier lives and sillier lives. And I think that there really are echoes of this and the way this has been managed and the way this has been sort of manipulated and promoted of the sort of populist groundswells that you see in politics and that we're seeing in this country at the moment. And look, obviously footy is not politics. Footy's a bit of a lark, and it should be anyway, and it's not real life, but it means a lot to people, and it's a big deal in this country. And I'm seeing parallels in the language of Essendon people at the moment.
Make Essendon great again, mega.
Make
what you might be alluding to?
And that sense of we're going to make you proud again, and that sense of extreme situations require extreme solutions, and this idea we're not going to get kicked around anymore. And you see that a lot, and it's not just online, it's not just from the nutters online, which there's some really measured Essendon people online, and
they're some of our favourite the nutters. Many of them probably listen to 110 percenters. We're not dismissing the nutters.
I think we're number one in the nutter demography.
Subcategory. That's right. Yeah.
They're our bread and butter. They certainly the ABC and Guardian as well, I think. But look, I think that, and there's an element with this push for Hird of a lot of it comes down to that we're not going to get kicked around anymore. And you guys aren't going to ridicule us anymore. And it's almost this, it's almost the people who are pushing this the most is what they hate the most about what's been happening at Essendon is not the ridicule. It's not all the jokes about when's the last time you played finals and all this sort of thing. It's the sense of irrelevance about Essendon and the fact that Essendon, and that was just encapsulated in that game against Fremantle when 25,000 people turned up in the rain. They get pissed on for 2 hours. The game's over in 5 minutes. And for many people, that was the lowest ebb for Essendon supporters. And you can see if enough build up of that, enough years of that you start thinking, well, maybe this guy can make us great again. Maybe this guy is the guy. I mean, maybe this guy who we loved more than any other player who we've ever seen is the man to sort of bring us to the promised land. So I understand that. I really do. I understand the mentality. I'm not sure whether that's going to be your angle, Matteo, but I get it. That these are extreme times and they need to do something different. I understand that. I just think that people have incredibly short memories and that people forget that the current predicament that this club is in, it's not because of Brad Scott and it's not because of Ben Rutten and it's not because of John Worsfold. It's because of what happened in 2012, 2013 and that period there. And the club is still paying for that. And the club and the people who are making the most noise at the moment still haven't moved on from that. The only way that this club is going to get to where it wants to be is if they do move on from that. And if they go back to Hird, that period is going to be referenced every single time they play, every single time they lose, every single time Hird speaks. The past is going to be there. And Essendon will never, ever be able to move on from that if they make this guy their head coach.
Floor is yours for your opening statement, Matteo.
Well, opening and closing, because I think Jonathan well and truly opened his shoulders and hit that one away to the cover boundary. So we'll see how much time I have. It's funny, while Jonathan was talking, I actually noticed that the way his name appears on the platform that we are using today, JH James Hird, Jonathan Horn. How fitting.
Jesus, who's hacked in this time? Come on.
We are giving listeners quite a peek behind the veil this week. Look, let me start with this point of, populism and feeling good and sugar hits. Sometimes sugar hits and populism, maybe they're the right answer. James Hird would give a lot of Essendon supporters something they've not felt for a long time. Happiness. At least a kind of corroded, compromised happiness. He has a strong affiliation with the good times. That is obviously where the kind of momentum from a lot of the supporter base comes from. That doesn't strengthen his coaching credentials, but it means that he'll probably begin with more political capital than any other candidate, and that political capital will erode more slowly. And I think that's a really important part here, because no coach would win a meaningful number of games with this list over the next 2 or 3 years. You could parachute Barassi, Pete Clarkson, Chris Scott in there. I don't think any of them would move the needle right now. So therefore, I think the Essendon job across 2027, 2028, it's not really about implementing a tactical system that's conducive to short-term success. And I think the criticism from, the kind of footy nerd Twitter community, or footy nerd community, let's sort of call them that, a lot of them has been, outside of Hird's maybe conduct, throughout the supplement saga or his complicity or whatever, has been about the fact that he's not, really been involved in the AFL system and at the sort of the vanguard of the way that the game has evolved in the last few years. I would argue that's not really what Essendon are searching for at the moment. I think they're searching for someone to help unite the club, to absorb outside scrutiny, and to develop young players while the list naturally improves to the point where it can actually be competitive. And, obviously get some good draft picks in. And if you don't think Hird's a good coach, well, then maybe that makes him, therefore, a decent candidate, because he'll get you good draft picks. So if that's what Essendon want, then maybe Hird is a decent candidate.
Interesting points there, Matteo. And thanks for referring to me as Socrates. I assume that's a reference to my Park Creek heritage.
Park Creek heritage.
Yeah. No, that's legit, guys. Look at it. No, I think that's a very good point. Jonathan, do you have any final rebuttals?
And I think Matteo makes a very good point. And this is something spoke about with Mark Duffield on SEN, is that there is a scenario where Hird, let's sort of spitball this a bit, where Hird is a director of coaching type arrangement, and he gets some young coaches, your James Kelly types, your Hayden Skipworth types, who fulfill that Essendon need to only have Essendon people involved, both of those obviously having played at the club. There's a scenario where I think that could work, where Hird's not actually the coach, but like a sort of Alex Ferguson type arrangement.
A Kevin Sheedy at GWS type.
Potentially, but then I sort of think of that and I think, well, what were Hird's sort of downfalls the last time when he was coach? Delegation, managing people, managing down. I think
Scope
maybe that might sort of dissuade some people from doing that. I think Essendon are going to do this, and I think this is in train. I think this is going to happen. We all need to get used to it. And I also think that it's a much better job to get than it was if he had got the job in 2022. I think maybe if ever it was the right time to bring him in, it would be now.
So, and I know I just breached my neutrality by adding to a couple of Jonathan's points there. I'll add to one of Matteo's. I'm a member of the Ainsley Footy Club, James Hird's junior footy club. So
there you go.
I do have some bias there. Any final thoughts, Matteo, before I declare a winner?
I'll consider that a point in my column. No, I don't think we actually have time, which might be in my interest, Cody, for you to declare a winner. So let's just call it a draw.
Okay. There's a lot of different definitions of a draw. Let's go with that.
Exactly. I'm going with the one that works for me. That's all we have time for on this episode of 110 Percenters. My thanks to Cody and Jonathan, and our thanks to you, listener. You've already done us a great favour by listening. Please keep listening. Please review, rate us, write to us, find us on Twitter. Until next week, I've been Matteo.
I've been Jonathan.
And I've been Cody.
And we're the 110 Percenters.